Okay, monetary policy. So, monetary policy is another way that the government can influence aggregate demand to try to impact the business cycle. Okay, so the way that monetary policy works, first we're going to talk about the part of the government that can do monetary policy. It's called the central bank. Okay, so central bank. Okay, so a central bank, monetary policy is the title. Okay, so central bank is a key term we'll want to know. Central bank is a part of the government, loosely, that has a couple jobs. Okay, so this is different than what you think of when you think of a bank. Okay, what you think of when you think of a bank is called a commercial bank. So like Chase, Wells Fargo, right? There are a million different ones, and they offer checking accounts and savings accounts and give loans, right? So if you need anything from a bank, you're going to go to a commercial bank, okay? But a central bank has a different job, okay? So they can influence the money supply, okay? So part of the government, okay, that has a couple jobs. So one of them is influence the money supply, okay? So they can increase or decrease the money supply, okay? They also regulate the commercial banks, okay? They regulate the commercial banks, okay? So influence money supply, regulate the commercial banks, okay? So like they make rules for Chase and Wells Fargo about what they can do for their customers, okay? And then another job of the central bank is called lender of last resort. So I'll write that one for you. Lender of last resort. Okay. So this one is cool because the banking system, right, the system where people deposit their money and then they make withdrawals when they need to, or they go to get loans, is a very important system in a market economy. But it's fragile because if everybody tries to withdraw their money from the bank at the same time, the banks will collapse, right? Because when you deposit your money in the bank, it doesn't just stay in the bank, right? The bank doesn't just lock it up. The bank lends out most of that money, okay? Which is cool because that means it's really, we're much more able to have loans than if the banks didn't lend out all that money. But it does mean that if everybody tries to withdraw their money at the same time, the bank doesn't have it, and so the banks collapse, okay? So an important job of the central bank is to give emergency loans to banks that didn't do anything wrong, but are experiencing a shortage of money because people are withdrawing all at the same time, okay? So lender of last resort is emergency loans to banks that are receiving a lot of withdrawals at the same time. Okay, so super important job. The central bank in the U.S. didn't do this job in 1929, and it let a bunch of banks collapse at the beginning of what turned out to be the Great Depression, right? But some economists think that if the central bank had given emergency loans to those banks and been a lender of last resort at the beginning of the Great Depression, then those banks wouldn't have collapsed, people wouldn't have lost all their money, and then the Great Depression really would not have been nearly as bad. Okay, so this is a really important job. Okay, cool. So that's our central bank. Okay, so this is the part of the government that does monetary policy, okay? Because monetary policy, okay, you ready? Is changing the money supply to influence aggregate demand. Okay, right? Trying to influence the business cycle. So in that way, it's similar to fiscal policy, right? Both work on aggregate demand. Both are trying to impact the business cycle. Okay. Then, monetary policy. Okay, so how it works is that the central bank in the United States, ours is called the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve. Okay, or long title Federal Reserve Bank. Okay, but we'll just call it the Federal Reserve, or even just the Fed. Okay, not the Feds, that's the federal government, but the Fed. Sorry, that's weird. The Fed. Okay, the Federal Reserve Bank. Okay, cool. So we might just refer to it from here on out. But every country that has a national currency has its own central bank. Okay, so there's a European central bank that controls the supply of euros. There's a British central bank that controls the supply of pounds. There's an Indian central bank that controls the supply of rupees. Okay, so every country has its own. Okay, so how monetary policy works. Okay, so they have to change the money supply to influence aggregate demand, right? So first we're going to talk about one major way that they change the money supply, okay? And then we're going to talk about the impact of that. Okay, so major way they change the money supply. Major way they change the money supply. Well, I'll write it out. Money supply. Major way they change the money supply. Okay, there are actually 3 ways, and if we were in school, we would talk about all 3, but there's really only one way that they ever use, so we're just going to talk about one. Okay, so it's called open market operations. Open market operations. Okay, so the open market desk at the Federal Reserve is the entity that does this action. Okay, but what they do is they buy and sell government bonds. Okay, so they buy and sell, or buy or sell, okay, government bonds. Government bonds with banks. Okay, so the commercial banks, right, like Chase and Wells Fargo, hold government bonds as a safe investment, right? So they lend out some of people's deposits, but also they use some deposits to buy government bonds because it pays a little bit of interest, and it's considered very safe. So the U.S. government's never not paid back those bonds. Whereas if a bank lends the money, then the person they lend it to might not pay them back, right? So it's appealing for them to hold some of these bonds. But that means that it's a pretty nifty tool that what the Federal Reserve can do is they can go to the banks and say, oh, hey, banks, we'll buy back some of your bonds and you can have the cash and we'll take the bond, right? But then that's cool because it means more money is going to be in circulation. So we're going to play this out so you can see how it works. Okay, so let's say the Fed buys bonds. Okay, so the open market desk at the Federal Reserve buys bonds. So they say, hey, banks, we want to buy, okay, this is an example, Okay, so, hey, banks, we're going to buy some of your government bonds, okay? And they make it worth the bank's while, right? And so the banks are like, okay, sure, we'll sell you your bonds. Okay, so the Fed buys the bonds. All right, so who gets the cash? Okay, so if the Fed buys bonds from the banks, who gets cash? That's right, the banks. Okay, so the Fed buys the bond. A bond's just a piece of paper. It's kind of a loan. Okay, so when people buy government bonds, they're giving cash to the government, and they have this bond that says $100 bond, right? And then at the end of a certain time period that they chose when they bought the bond, they get that money back plus extra money as interest. Okay, so it's a kind of an investment, right? And so when the Fed buys these bonds from the banks get the cash instead of having the bond. Okay, so Fed buys the bonds, banks get the cash. Okay, right? So now your Chase, Wells Fargo, right, has more cash, right? And so it's going to be appealing for them to lend that because otherwise they don't get any interest on it, right? So banks get cash, so then they're going to want to lend, right? Want to lend. Okay, so if they want to lend more, how do they get people to borrow more? Right? Because at this interest rate, people are already borrowing what they want to borrow, right? Right, so what could the bank do to get people to borrow the more money that the bank wants to lend them? That's right, they have to lower the interest rate. They lower the interest rate. Okay, so the interest rate is a market price of borrowing and saving money, okay? And so to get more people to want to borrow it, the banks have to lower the interest rate. So they say, okay, well, we want you to borrow this money, so take this lower interest rate, okay? And so the lower interest rate, right? Think about who's going to see that lower interest rate and change their actions, right? Remember, change in interest rate was a shifter we talked about. Right? So who sees that lower interest rate and says, oh, I could do things differently and that would be awesome, right? Exactly, right? Consumers, right? Change in interest rate is a consumption shifter. So consumers will see, oh, wow, it's a lower interest rate. This would be a good time for me to borrow money to buy new furniture or buy a new car, right? And then also investment, right? Especially investment is very sensitive to the interest rate, right? Because when firms are deciding if they want to borrow money to build a new capital or build a new factory, right? They're going to think, oh, well, how much do I have to pay to borrow that money, right? And that's the interest rate. So at that lower interest rate, more firms are going to say, oh, wow, I wasn't thinking of building a new factory right now, but oh man, that's a better interest rate. This maybe would be a good time for me to build a new factory. Okay, so consumption and spending and investment spending go up. And also remember, people buying new houses is investment, right? And that's definitely very sensitive to the interest rate because houses are expensive. Okay. So if you can borrow money cheaper, that's an appealing thing. Okay. So let's work it the other way. So let's say the Fed, so this is expansionary, right? Because this is going to increase aggregate demand. Okay, so this is expansionary monetary policy. Expansionary monetary policy, right? It would increase aggregate demand. Okay. All right, so now let's have the Fed sell bonds. Okay, I wouldn't recommend memorizing this, but just remember, if the Fed is selling the bonds, think about who gets the cash. So if the Fed sells bonds, that's where they go to the banks and say, hey, banks, how about you give us your cash and we'll give you a U.S. government bond, right? And again, they make it worth the bank's while, so the banks want to do it, right? But then the banks give their cash to the Fed. And so if the Fed has the cash, it is out of circulation in the Fed vault. Nobody can use it, right? So the Fed sells bonds. The Fed gets the cash. Okay? Fed gets cash into vault, right? Right? That money is out of circulation. Okay? So now the banks have less cash. Okay? Right? Banks have less cash because they just gave their cash, some of their cash to the Fed. Okay? So do they want to lend more or less now that they have less cash? Yeah, they want to lend less. Whoops, want to lend less. Okay, they want to lend less. All right. So then what happens to the interest rate then if they're okay with lending less money? Right, so they realize, oh, well, since we're okay with lending less money, right, we don't have as much money to lend, we could charge a higher interest rate and still lend out all of our money, right? So what they're going to do is they're going to raise the interest rate. If they didn't raise the interest rate, then they would run out of loans, right? There'd be a lot more people wanting to borrow money than they have money to lend. And that'd be silly, right? Because they could raise the interest rate, make more money, and still lend it all. So they're going to do that. They're going to raise the interest rate, okay? Then who's going to see that and respond? Who's going to change their action because the interest rate went up? Okay, yeah, it's mostly firms, right? They're going to say, oh, yikes, wow, I was thinking of buying a bunch of new capital, but oh man, borrowing money is expensive right now. No thanks, right? So some of that investment spending isn't going to happen, right? And then some consumption spending isn't going to happen, right? The consumer's going to say, oh man, I was thinking of buying a new car, but oh, wow, interest rates are higher. That would be a lot more expensive for me to borrow to buy a new car, so no thanks. So they don't do that consumption, okay? Right, so aggregate demand goes down. And so this is what kind of monetary policy? Contractionary. Yeah, because it'll decrease aggregate demand. Contractionary monetary policy. Cool. Yep, contractionary monetary policy. All right, so that's that. That's the tool that they're going to use. Okay, cool. So then the impact is intended on aggregate demand. So now, of course, this would be like in a perfect world, right, where the monetary policy works perfectly. But remember, we don't live in a perfect world, right? So let's talk about some problems, some ways in which this does not work as smoothly as we might wish, okay? Because, of course, let's think about this. When would we want to do expansionary monetary policy? Right? What would be going on in the macroeconomy for us to be like, oh, yeah, if we could do an expansionary monetary policy, that'd be so great right now? Yeah, recession, right? Or recessionary gap. Yeah, so recession is when we'd want to do this, okay? right? We'd want to do an expansionary monetary policy during a recession, okay? And then when would we want to do a contractionary monetary policy, right? What would be going on in the economy to make us think, oh yeah, contractionary monetary policy, that's the ticket. That's exactly what we want. Yeah, inflation, right? Especially because inflation is so connected to the money supply, right? For reasons we talked about, changing the money supply is really the only way to get noticeable inflation or deflation. So yeah, if inflation is the concern, contractionary monetary policy is so great, right? It's the ticket. Okay, so if monetary policy worked perfectly, then we would use it just like that in recessions and high inflation, and that'd be fine, right? So since money is so connected to inflation, generally contractionary monetary policy does work very well to reduce inflation. However, if the inflation is because supply is decreased, then you're still going to get inflation even if you contract your monetary policy. So there's that. But mostly the problem with the monetary policy is during the recession, okay? So the way the monetary policy works is the Fed buys the bonds. So the Fed gets the bond, the banks get the cash, they want to lend it, so they lower the interest rate. But here's the thing. In a recession, right, the economy just crashed. People are losing their jobs, everybody's panicking, right? It's just kind of a bad time all around. And especially if the banks have been burned, which is pretty common, right? Because if a lot of people lose their jobs, then that means more people aren't paying their house loans, right? Or not paying back their other loans. And so the banks could be getting burned during this time, right? Maybe they feel like, oh no, all these people aren't paying back their loans. That's terrible. We don't have enough money. This is awful, right? And so if that's the case, are they going to be eager to lend? Are they going to be like, oh wow, the Fed gave us some cash, we should lend it? Not really, right? So banks might not want to lend during a recession, right? They might be scared. They might not feel like they want to take more risk because they already probably have a lot of people not paying back their loans. Banks might not want to lend. Oops. Sorry, that's weird. Banks might not want to lend during recession. That is, they might be scared, right? Okay. Right? Because probably a lot of people aren't paying back their loans already, so they might be too scared and not want to lend, okay? And so if the banks just sit on this money, okay, and they don't lower the interest rate, then there's going to be no impact. There's going to be no expansionary monetary policy. It's not going to work, okay? So them being scared and not lending stops the monetary policy from having any effect, and there's nothing the Federal Reserve can do about that. Okay? Because notice, even though the Fed initiates this monetary policy, there's nothing they can do if the banks don't want to lend it, right? The rest of this process depends on the banks wanting to lend, and if they don't, then there's nothing the Fed can do about it. Okay, another issue exactly along the same line is, okay, so even if the the banks want to lend, they lower the interest rate during a recession. During a recession, what are consumers feeling? Yeah, they're scared, right? They're afraid of losing their jobs, right? So even as the interest rate goes down, are people who are scared of losing their jobs going to be like, oh, wow, the interest rate's down. I'm going to drop a bunch of money on things that I could wait on, right? Right? They're not going to be interested in doing that, right? So if consumers don't want to borrow, then we're not going to see any effect from this either, right? There's going to be no increase in aggregate demand, okay? So if consumers are scared of losing jobs, okay, so if consumers are scared of losing jobs, they won't respond to low interest rate. Okay, so they're scared of losing their job, they're not going to respond to the low interest rate. They're not going to consume more because of the lower interest rate. And same for the firms, right? So in this time, the firms, right, what are they feeling during a recession? Right? People aren't buying their products. They don't know how many workers they're going to have to fire. They don't know if they're going to survive the recession. They're scared, right? They're feeling lower demand for their products. So during this time, if you say to them, hey, you could take out a big loan at a really low interest rate and build a new factory or upgrade your capital, right? They might bet that things will get better by the time their new factory is up and running, right? Because it takes, 2 years or whatever to build a new factory, right? So most recessions end within that time. So it's not a bad idea for the company to bet, you know what? I bet we're going to survive this and it'd be great once demand is back to normal to have this new factory, right? So some firms might respond to this lower interest rate, but for the most part, firms are scared, right? So it's not going to look appealing to them to take on a bunch of debt to build up their capacity if they feel like people are not going to want that, right? So firms, too scared to make investments, right? They're not going to be very interested in building a new factory right now if people aren't even buying their products. Okay, so that's definitely something. Okay, so, but some advantages of monetary policy. I'm sorry, I got the wrong advantages. So, advantages of monetary policy. So, there are a couple things monetary policy does a lot better than fiscal policy. So, let's talk about those. So, fiscal policy has really terrible incentive problems, right? Your politicians only do what's popular and not what's right. But in monetary policy, the people who are making the decisions, right, the decision makers at the Federal Reserve, are appointed by the president one at a time, and there are 7 of them, and they serve 14-year terms, okay? So, Fed governors, they're called, serve 14-year terms. Okay, these are 14-year terms. So every 2 years, one of them rotates off and a new one gets appointed. And so there's 7 of them, right? Okay, and they can't be reappointed. They can only serve one term. Okay, right. So if they can't be reappointed, they only serve one term, and there's not really any way to get them off. So they can't, be kicked out or whatever, right? They serve their term. Okay, and so this is good incentive-wise, right? Because they can't be reappointed, so they're not trying to do what's popular, right? They have a very long term, right? So there's no reason for them, again, to do what's popular and not what they think is best. The governors are typically economics professors or people who have a lot of knowledge about the macroeconomy. Okay. So whereas your average congressperson almost certainly has no training in economics. Okay. Which actually, it's some benefit for sure if you're trying to make these sort of decisions. But a lot of the problems that monetary policy faces is uncertainty, right? We don't know what the future holds. We don't know what impact changing the money supply will have. We don't know how much impact it'll have. You don't know how much you should change the money supply. So there are still significant information problems, even though your Fed governors are expert economists, right? It's just that even expert economists have no idea what the future looks like and how much impact things are going to have. So there's that. So there's like an information problem on that. So we'll put that in problems. Information problem. Okay. But the Fed is independent of Congress and the president. Oops. Independent of Congress and president. Okay. Independent of Congress and the president. So because they're not reappointed, they're not reelected, Congress can't tell them what to do, the president can't tell them what to do. And that's great, right? Because if the president and Congress could tell your part of the government that can change the money supply what to do, they would just tell that part of the money supply or the government to print money all the time, right? Because Congress never has enough money to do all the things it wants to do, right? We talked about how it's mountains of debt. The president is very subject to political pressure, right? And would always love to be able to spend more money, right? And do more government spending on things that the voters will like, right? And so it's super important if you want to avoid crazy inflation for your central bank to be independent of Congress and the president, okay? Because otherwise the pressure would be just hyperinflate all the time. And obviously that's terrible, as we've talked about. Okay, so that's cool. Cool. All right. So, yeah, that's great. Then, let's do a quick example so you can see how this plays out. Okay. So I'm going to draw an economy in a recession. Okay. So our GDP, PL, economy, SRAS. Okay, so draw an economy in a recession, okay, and then, so we'll say the economy is in a recession, and the Federal Reserve buys bonds, okay? So, buys bonds. So we think about that. All right, so we know the Federal Reserve buys bonds, okay? So we think about who gets the cash. So the Federal Reserve's buying bonds from the banks. Who gets the cash? So the Fed gets the bonds, the bank gets the cash, okay? So the bank gets the cash. They are more able to lend, so the interest rate goes. So they have more money to lend. To get more people to borrow it, they have to lower the interest rate, okay? So lower interest rate, okay? And in response to that lower interest rate, there's going to be an increase in consumption and investment, right? As people are like, oh, yeah, this is a great time for me to expand my business. Or, oh, sorry, I forgot to draw recession here. Sorry. Okay, so we drew recession, sorry. YF, LRAS, Y1. Okay, so your Y1 is less than YF. It's a recessionary gap. Okay. And then as long as you increase your aggregate demand, it does not matter how much, right? Because the Fed has no idea how much impact this monetary policy is going to have, right? So I made mine too small. You can make it perfectly sized. You can make it too big and cause inflation, right? Any of those are a possibility because the Fed has no idea how much impact this is going to have, right? Even the best economists can't anticipate how much reaction people will have to this change in the money supply. Okay, so that's that. Easy peasy, right? And your shifters change in interest rate. And then you should indicate, of course, how the part of GDP is affected, or sorry, the part of aggregate demand. Change in interest rate. Okay. Easy peasy, right? So, yeah, that's that. Good job, team.